Hey folks, my name is Mike. This is KEI Fabrication and welcome to my shop.
Still has the ladder. As long as it's tied down well enough, I guess it'll be all right. I guess that means he's got to step up on him. Yeah. Well, he certainly has more than a step up with the size of that ladder. He's going to take
That's a sound I really fell in love with when I was a young kid. Alright, so now the truck is fixtured at the proper ride height. I have to take the wheel off and I got to take the spindle off and all those things to make sure that I get my caster settings and the modifications I'm going to make. Put the spindle center line back where it needs to be. So as a reference, you can do this a couple of ways. Now I have a nice surface here that's not going to go away or change, so I can measure from that surface up to my reference here to the spindle center line, and I'm using the level to get a vertical measurement, and I'm at 12 3/8. The other way is if it's a temporary surface or something like that is going on, you can establish a reference point on something that's not going to move. So I'm actually going to do both because there is a high probability that the fender is going to come off of this thing sometime soon, and I'm looking at 13 5/8 in that direction. So I'm going to write that down right on a piece of tape because I know my memory is going to fail me. So when I take the wheel off, you'll see a little scissor jack that I can position this exactly where it needs to remain. I could even weld a stinger from my surface plate here to the bottom of the control arm to hold it where it needs to be, and if I do it correctly, it'll be out of the way and I can establish my geometry without disturbing the ride height. So I'm going to do the check from here to here one more time. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this so I know I'm measuring to a surface that's a little more firm. And again, I use the level as a horizontal reference because once the wheel and tire is off, now I can use this center drill as my measurement, and if I use that, it'll be the same as this as long as I take my time and measure it correctly. So this is just some reference dimensions that need to happen before I disassemble anything. Making sure that I'm lined up with the center of the spindle and my bubble is in the middle, and I'm looking at 12 7/16. Okay? So I'm going to write that over here. And that's from the ground up, right? The spindle center line from here down to the spindle center line was 13 5/8. From the ground up to the spindle center line was 12 7/16. Hopefully, I'll be able to decode this, when I come back after lunch and remember exactly what that meant. So that'll give me the ability to take the tire off, put the spindle back where it belongs, and then I'm Alright, I got a lot going on in this truck, as I mentioned before many times. I got way ahead. I added too many things to the list to make all these changes. Just getting to the point now where I can get back to where I was and accomplish some of these goals. Well, I need to prioritize some things. First and foremost is I have to get the rack and pinion in its final location. It's not there yet. The reason is I still need to shorten the steering arms. And I need to adjust the steering arms a little bit more to get just a tiny bit more Ackerman. And that's going to take a lot of surveying with both the left and the right sides to determine the amount of toe out on turns, which is basically the result of having Ackerman in the system, to stay within the parameters of all of the things that I want to do with this vehicle. Once the steering arm and the rack are located, the final installation is really going to be determined by the bump steer. There are rules of thumb with bump steer on, if you recognize a trend that's not good, that there is some fixes for that. And doing all of these things is the reason why I'm doing this, is to basically get the bump steer minimized. The other thing, when you shorten the steering arms in the position of the rack location, you have to make sure that when the wheel is at full lock, that the steering arm doesn't take the tie rod end over center and kind of snap into a locked position. So I've got to be aware of that. And then once this is fully located, then I can connect the rack to the steering shaft. I have all the parts to do this. The reason why it's not done is when I abandoned this project, I was in the middle of this operation. In the middle of this operation is when I decided that I was going to lower the truck. So once the rack and the bump steer and the steering is identified, then we can move on to, I need to modify the location of the lower ball joint to gain some caster. And the reason I need to do that is when I did the survey yesterday, once I established the ride height, when I turn full lock this way, I do get some rub here. This is the inner fender well, but it's also, it turns immediately into the firewall, and I really don't want to take a sledgehammer to the firewall. So the trick is, if I adjust the lower control arm so the lower ball joint moves forward just a little bit, I'll gain like a ½ inch of clearance back here. Now these tires are, the diameter and width is kind of like the worst case scenario. These are 225 55s. I'm sorry, 215 55s on a 7-inch wide rim. The diameter here could potentially get a tiny bit smaller if I went to a 205 or something like that. So there's some room to make up more clearance here, but I'm going to try to avoid that. As a matter of fact, the tire that I'm going to use to mock up all this is a 245/45 17. Actually, this diameter is almost identical to that, and that's why it's on here. So anyway, the camber and caster, as far as the upper control arm location, I want to make sure that I can achieve the amount of caster and camber for road racing and drifting, but I also want to make sure that I accommodate some, hopefully what would be real quick adjustments in the form of camber to get it more friendly for drag racing. So this is my priority. Until all of this is established, I really don't want to go hog wild on anything else. Alright, so I'm going to pull this apart, put my, take my steering arms off, get those where I would like them to be, and measure bump steer, get the rack in its final location. I'm saying that like it's all going to happen in a short period of time. This could take days to get this to happen. So I really need to make a conscious effort to stick to my priority. Took you guys out of focus. To stick to my priority and, you know, get the top part of this list done so I can move on to this. Hopefully you folks will get excited about what's going on here, because This is going to be pretty involved. This I have the option to either go with aftermarket upper control arms or Alright, I'm going to apologize for the heater running right off the get-go. So one of the dilemmas I have, hopefully you can see this. This is the rack in its temporary location and the tie rod end. The Mazda from the factory has the ball joint, the tie rod end go through the top. When it was a steering box, that was acceptable. You can see that if I left it in its stock location, I've got this crazy angle that happens with the tie rod end. So one of the priorities to help me position this rack properly is I need to cut my steering arms apart, flop it over so it comes out the bottom, and that really helps the angle of the rack. But what it tells me already is that my rack could stand to go slightly up, and I know that if I line these up and I turn my wheel at full lock, you can see how much the rack wants to angle backward when I'm at full lock. And I am going to make that a little worse because to get quicker steering and a little more Ackerman, when I cut this loose, I'm also going to move it rearward slightly, and I'm going to move it out slightly. And that's how you adjust Ackerman. If it's a front steer car, basically the tie rod end mounting point needs to come closer to the rotor or the wheel. So again, that's all part of my survey. So I got to cut this all apart, get this where I want it, move the rack into a more favorable location, and tack it all together. Then I need to do my steering angle survey and my Ackerman survey. So I actually have to do this to both sides to get the toe out on turns correct and get the percentage where it needs to be. All at the same time getting the rack repositioned. So all of this has to happen simultaneously for it to end up where it actually needs to be. So long explanation, but that's why this stuff takes days and weeks rather than just a couple hours. Those of you who don't have a lift and are doing this in your driveway, man, God bless you, because persistence and perseverance is the only way that this stuff happens. And you folks have the disadvantage of that being complicated by not having these constants and getting rid of the variables, not including the weather and all those other things that In case you're wondering how much Ackerman I have right now, if I connect the dots between the lower ball joint and the center of the tie rod end in reference to the spindle flange here, you can see that, hopefully you can see that, the two lines are almost parallel. What does that mean? That means I have very little Ackerman. So the object is to move this out a little bit so I gain more of an angle from the center of the steering arm through the center of the lower ball joint, and that is what adjusts the toe out on turn. So anyway, hopefully that's a quick explanation. So my goal is to flip this over, short. So another revelation that I came to yesterday was when I established the new ride height, it was clear that my geometry of my lower control arm and my upper control arm actually was very favorable to good performance at this new ride height. The first thing that came into play is that the lower control arm is almost parallel with the ground, and the angle of my lower ball joint is actually, even at this ride height, it is right in the middle of its articulation. So the lower ball joint is almost completely perpendicular to the body of the ball joint. So I've got a full range of motion up or down for whatever degree of freedom is available with the lower ball joint. So, and the other thing is my upper control arm from the pivot point on the frame to the center of the pivot on the upper ball joint is at a slight upward slope. That's also pretty good because that gives me camber gain when the suspension settles. So I'm okay with that. This angle could be slightly less, and I may actually be cutting the mounts off of the frame and welding them in a different location based on what my findings are. So what does that mean? Well, initially I thought to get the ride height that I wanted is I was going to have no choice but to use the 2-inch drop spindle from Chassis Tech. The reason why I am happy that I don't have to use that is the geometry here is looking very good. The second reason is this right here. The steering arm is attached way down here on that ball joint, on that drop spindle, which would help in the alignment of this, no questions asked, but I still need to increase my Ackerman with that, and I need to increase my steering angle by shortening the connection of that outer tie rod end. So the fact that I have the ability to modify this by removing it or even fabricating another version of this is, to me, a reason to keep it. And the last reason is that Chassis Tech drop spindle probably weighs 10 pounds more than the factory spindle. I would have had to do some extensive modifications to that Chassis Tech spindle, and that would have just created, a multitude of complications because it would all be trial and error. Right now, as far as this spindle is concerned, the only modifications I need to do is this right here. And by having Alright, so I'm going to get rid of all the stuff that's going to eventually cause me problems. I'm getting rid of the sway bar attachment point. I'm getting rid of Alright, we got the majority of the stuff cut off. All the bump stops, sway bar support. And once the rough-in of all this suspension work is complete, I'll take everything off, grind all the welds down and make it smooth and look pretty, and then throw on. Alright, one quick note about the drop spindle not being used is one of the reasons why I was able to stick with the stock spindle is I already did the ball joint relocation, and I actually added another ½ inch of space between the control arm and the ball joint. So I think if you saw the total drop there was an inch plus. I'm not lowering it, slamming it with the tires buried in the wheel wells. I'm lowering it just to improve cornering performance and so on and so forth. So if I use the drop spindle, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, I still would have had to cut off a whole bunch of stuff relative to the steering arm, relocate it, reposition it. It's heavy. The result might have only been from where it is right now to maybe 3/4 of an inch more. So all right, folks, hopefully you can see that and that. So this is a substantial amount of angle with the rack installed. The steering tie rod end geometry and the shortened steering arms just might work. And I've got as much angle when the rack is fully extended. So the whole purpose of getting this ride height established was to get to this point. I need to figure out where my steering arms need to be in order to get the turning radius that I want, and is this particular rack that I selected going to be able to deliver that. One of the issues I have, and if you watch this closely, is this is the length tie rod end total that I need. Outer tie rod end connected to the inner tie rod end. Well, watch what happens. This is the stock Mazda tie rod end, and its length is about 2 inches too short. Well, I think I might have found through the MOOG tie rod end catalog, because it allows you to select your information for your searches based on some specific things, like the thread of the inner tie rod end, a female style tie rod end. Then it gives you all of the available options with that criteria. And as it turns out, there's one out there that actually will give me the proper thread engagement and the proper length. So I'm going to take the tie rod socket with me, and I actually have a tie rod pin. That's going to be the big question mark, is if everything is good as far as length and style and type, is the taper similar? I'm hoping that the taper from one vehicle to another is some sort of industry standard. So, all right, the parts store that I'm gonna go to is O'Reilly's. They have them available same day. Okay, folks, the part came in. I got it mocked up here. It's not tacked or anything yet, but it's just to make sure that my geometry is gonna be okay. This is the tie rod end that I found through the MOOG catalog. You can see that it is significantly longer than the Mazda one. And I've got 1 3/4 inches of engagement with plenty of room to adjust toe, either a little bit toe out or a little bit of toe in. So the tie rod end itself, I think, is going to work. The taper angle is the same, but the depth, the diameter of the taper is slightly less than, and you can see I can't get a cotter pin in here, so I'm gonna have to maybe invest in a tapered reamer to increase the depth of that, or find a steering arm that the tie rod end engages correctly. I've got to make a radical adjustment to my steering arm anyway, so I'm not concerned with maybe running to the salvage yard and grabbing a spindle that this fits in correctly and just kind of taking the steering arm off of it and adapting it to the Mazda spindle. So that's the update. I'll keep you posted. Some of you asked how the rack was bolted in. I've got a cross member that was necessary to allow the LS swap installation, and it provided a good foundation for some threaded bungs to be welded to it. It's not finished. The mock-up is not completed yet. I'm going to raise the rack up just a tiny bit and rotate it back just a little bit, and that'll actually improve the angle of the tie rod end in relationship to the control arm and all the other geometry that's going on. So another minor adjustment of the rack position, and I think it'll actually improve bump steer. It'll eliminate the oversteer and snapping to full lock. If you're wondering what kind of angle that achieves, that's the turning in, and that's turning out. Alright, I got a tremendous amount of work to do here, so I'm going to start out slow and taper off. Alright folks, that's it for this time. Remember, if you can't be good, be spectacular.